It began in the ashes of a dying empire. By early 1945, the Third Reich was collapsing under the weight of Allied bombardment. Cities like Berlin, Dresden, and Hamburg lay in ruins, symbols of a once formidable war machine now crumbling from within. But beneath the chaos, something else was unfolding, a silent race for the future. Allied intelligence officers, driven by whispered reports of secret laboratories and advanced weaponry, began to move in. They were not just fighting for victory, they were hunting for knowledge. One name echoed through the halls of Allied command: Peenemünde. It was there, on the Baltic coast, that German engineers had developed the V-2 rocket, the world's first long-range guided ballistic missile. The weapon had terrorized London only months before, leaving behind cratered streets and broken lives. But the technology behind it was far beyond anything the Allies possessed. If captured, it could change the course of modern warfare. In March 1945, as the US Third Army under General George S. Patton advanced across Germany, special units were attached to its front lines with a singular mission: find the scientists. These were the men of the Alsos mission, a small, highly trained intelligence unit led by Colonel Boris Pasch and scientific director Samuel Gaudsmit. Their task was to track down Germany's nuclear, chemical, and rocket research before the Soviets did. The war was ending, but the next one, a war of science and ideology, was already beginning. Patton's forces raced eastward, seizing towns like Nordhausen and Bleicherode, unaware that beneath the mountains lay the Mittelwerk facility, an underground factory where slave laborers assembled V-2 rockets for Hitler's vengeance campaign. When the Americans entered the tunnels, the air was thick with the stench of oil, death, and secrecy. Stacked among the wreckage were hundreds of unfinished missiles, their sleek frames glinting in the dim light. It was a glimpse into the technological heart of Nazi ambition, and a prize both Washington and Moscow were desperate to claim. Among the captured materials were documents stamped Geheime Reichssache, top secret of the Reich. Blueprints, notes, and experimental data revealed breakthroughs in aerodynamics, propulsion, and jet technology. Somewhere behind these designs stood the minds that had conceived them: Werner von Braun, Arthur Rudolph, and a network of scientists tied to the SS and the Luftwaffe's secret weapons divisions. The Americans realized they weren't just uncovering weapons, they were uncovering a vision of the future, one that could be reshaped, redirected, and repurposed. But the hunt was not simple. Soviet troops were advancing rapidly from the east, occupying key sites and seizing both equipment and personnel. Stalin's NKVD agents were performing their own version of scientific looting, codenamed Operation Osoaviakim, targeting the same German experts. Every hour counted. Orders from Chef, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, were clear: secure the scientists before the Russians could reach them. On April 11, 1945, American troops captured the town of Bleicherode. Nearby in the Harz Mountains, von Braun's team had already fled Peenemünde and taken refuge. Many were uncertain whom to surrender to, the Soviets or the Americans. Von Braun, aware that his allegiance would determine his fate, made a calculated decision. In a move that would shape post-war history, he instructed his engineers to seek out the US Army and offer their expertise in exchange for protection. Days later, they were intercepted by a patrol from the US 44th Infantry Division and taken into custody. In the aftermath, the Americans quietly transferred the scientists and their families to a secure camp near Witzenhausen. The paperwork was minimal, the secrecy absolute. What began as a mission to prevent Nazi technology from falling into Soviet hands soon became something larger: a covert extraction operation with political implications far beyond the battlefield. As victory in Europe loomed, US intelligence officers sent coded messages back to Washington outlining their discoveries. German rocket engineers secured, one report read, potential value incalculable. Yet even in triumph, questions lingered. How many of these men were complicit in the regime's atrocities? What crimes had been overlooked in the name of progress? The ruins of Germany hid more than rubble. They hid moral dilemmas that would shadow the victors for decades. The Allies had won the war, but in the pursuit of knowledge, they were about to blur the line between justice and ambition. In the fading light of 1945, as Allied convoys rolled across the German countryside, trucks laden with blueprints and captured scientists disappeared into the west. No official announcement was made, no flags raised. The public believed the war had ended, but for a handful of officers in the intelligence corps, a new and secret mission had just begun. One that would determine who controlled the future of science and ultimately the fate of the world. May 1945. The guns of Europe were falling silent, but a new kind of battle had begun. While victory parades filled the streets of London and New York, in the ruins of Germany, American officers in plain uniforms combed through abandoned laboratories, warehouses and bombed-out estates. Their orders came from the highest levels of command. Identify, locate, and secure German scientists capable of changing the balance of global power. The name for this covert mission was deceptively bureaucratic: Operation Paperclip. Officially, it was part of the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, JIOA, a newly formed group under the War Department. Its public purpose sounded routine: to utilize German specialists for US military advantage. But behind closed doors, it carried a different directive: to acquire the intellectual capital of the Third Reich before the Soviets could seize it. The Cold War had not yet been declared, but its first shots were already being fired in laboratories and intelligence offices, not on battlefields. One of the primary targets was Werner von Braun, the charismatic 33-year-old director of Germany's V2 rocket program. His work had brought devastation to Britain. Over 3,000 V2 rockets had struck London, Antwerp, and Liège, killing more than 9,000 civilians. Yet, to American scientists and military planners, von Braun represented something more than a war criminal. He was a key to the future, the man who could unlock the secrets of long-range missiles and perhaps even spaceflight. Von Braun and his team, stationed in Peenemünde before the Allied advance, had surrendered to American forces in Austria on May 2, 1945. When interrogated, von Braun spoke not as a Nazi officer but as a visionary engineer. "We wanted to reach the moon," he said. "The rockets were never meant for war. They were meant for exploration." It was a carefully crafted narrative, one that downplayed his SS, membership, and the slave labor conditions at Mittelwerk. But it worked. Within weeks, von Braun was quietly moved to a secure compound for debriefing. Meanwhile, other branches of the operation were unfolding across Germany. Army intelligence units recovered jet aircraft designs from Messerschmitt facilities, chemical formulas from IG Farben plants, and prototype radar systems hidden in Bavarian barns. In one operation near Nordhausen, a team of engineers discovered crates marked A9A10, plans for an intercontinental rocket theoretically capable of reaching New York. The implications were staggering. The technology of the defeated enemy could shape not just the next war, but the entire future of warfare itself. Inside the Pentagon, a fierce debate erupted. Could the United States, the self-proclaimed defender of liberty, employ men who had served Hitler? The War Department's legal division argued that many of these scientists were guilty of crimes against humanity. But General Leslie Groves, the same man who had overseen the Manhattan Project, pushed for immediate action. "Their knowledge is essential," he wrote in a classified memo. "We cannot allow it to fall into Soviet hands." By late 1945, President Truman faced a moral and strategic dilemma. Publicly, he had ordered that no active supporters of Nazism should be brought to the United States. Privately, military intelligence found a loophole. Personnel files were edited, SS affiliations erased, and new identities fabricated. Scientists once registered as enemies of the Allied cause were reclassified as war assets. It was an act of quiet hypocrisy, but one justified under the banner of national security. In a debriefing report labeled Top Secret, Eyes Only, Colonel Holger Toftoy of the US Army Ordnance Corps outlined the mission's priorities. "Our objective is not merely to study captured equipment, it is to employ the men who designed it." That statement marked a turning point. Operation Paperclip ceased to be a recovery mission. It became a recruitment drive. Among those listed were not only rocket engineers but also experts in chemical warfare, aviation medicine, and biological experimentation. Names like Hubertus Strughold, Kurt Blome, and Walter Schreiber, men with direct ties to concentration camp research, appeared on the rosters. Some were accused of conducting fatal experiments on prisoners at Dachau. Yet in the sanitized documents prepared for American officials, those histories vanished. They became aeromedical consultants, biological researchers, technical advisors. Their pasts were buried under ink and intention. The WWII operated from an unmarked office in Washington, D.C. Its members worked behind locked doors, reviewing dossiers and preparing transport orders. Security classification, highest, one memo read. No publicity, no acknowledgement. Air Force C-47 transports began ferrying personnel from Germany to US bases in Europe under the pretext of post-war reconstruction. The press never noticed, and yet, within the ranks of Allied intelligence, not everyone agreed. A small group of investigators from the War Crimes Office raised concerns that the operation might be obstructing justice. "We are harboring men who should be standing trial at Nuremberg," one report warned. But their voices were drowned out by the urgency of the new geopolitical reality. The Soviet Union was no longer an ally. It was the next threat. And in that shadow, moral questions gave way to strategic imperatives. By the end of 1945, over 700 German specialists were under US custody. More were on the way. Their talents had built Hitler's weapons of terror. Now they would build America's arsenal of deterrence. Operation Paperclip had begun not as a public triumph, but as a quiet, calculated gamble to trade moral clarity for scientific supremacy. In the eyes of history, it would become one of the most controversial bargains ever struck, one whose consequences were only beginning to unfold. By the spring of 1946, the war had ended, but its secrets were still being moved in silence. Across the shattered landscape of occupied Germany, hundreds of scientists, engineers and technicians, once loyal to the Third Reich, began to vanish. They weren't fugitives escaping justice, but passengers on an invisible network of American convoys. Operation Paperclip was entering its covert phase. The world believed the Allies were dismantling the Nazi war machine. In truth, they were salvaging its most valuable parts. The Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, JIOA, had refined its method. Each German scientist was assigned a false biography, stripped of Nazi affiliations, and given a new classification: Special Civilian Employee of the US Army. The term was vague by design. It allowed military transport and housing without formal immigration records. In some cases, even the scientists' families were given forged identities, their SS connections erased from history. The documentation, marked top secret, was stored in the archives of the Pentagon, out of reach and out of sight. In June 1946, the first major group of scientists was quietly relocated to a US base near Landshut, Bavaria. They were guarded not as prisoners but as assets. The men worked under code names, translating technical manuals, reconstructing blueprints, and answering the one question their captors valued most: what did Germany know that America didn't? Many of them, like rocket engineer Arthur Rudolph, provided detailed reports on the design of the V-2 guidance systems, explaining components so advanced they seemed decades ahead of Allied technology. Meanwhile, the moral fog surrounding the operation deepened. British and French intelligence were aware of the US extractions, but protests were quietly ignored. The Soviets, however, were furious. Their own recruitment drive, Operation Osoaviakhim, had begun in October 1946, when Soviet troops raided over 300 German research sites and forcibly relocated more than 2,000 specialists to the USSR. To Washington, this confirmed that Paperclip was not just opportunism, it was survival in the new Cold War. Inside Germany, the secrecy took on an eerie rhythm. Families of missing scientists reported their relatives taken by the Americans. Villages whispered of men who had once worn SS uniforms now living in guarded compounds. Even the German press, under Allied censorship, could not investigate. The official story was that these individuals were being questioned for technical intelligence. The truth was far more unsettling. They were being offered a second life in exchange for service. One of the first to make the transatlantic journey was Dr. Hubertus Strughold, a Luftwaffe medical researcher who had overseen experiments on human endurance and low-pressure effects at Dachau. His work had caused suffering and death, but in American records, his past became aeromedical studies of high-altitude conditions. Within a few years, he would be called the father of space medicine. His arrival at Randolph Air Force Base in Texas marked the beginning of a transformation that would later define NASA's research culture. The irony was profound. and hidden. To move these scientists, the US Army established a web of logistical routes across Europe. Some traveled by truck convoys through Munich, others by rail through Bremerhaven, where US naval transports waited. Each journey ended the same way, with a coded manifest and sealed orders. The ships bore no public markings, their passengers listed as technicians. When they reached America, the names of these men disappeared from official immigration logs. They were ghosts entering the New World. In the small Alabama town of Huntsville, the first contingent of von Braun's rocket engineers arrived under tight security. They were stationed at Fort Bliss, Texas, but conducted most of their field testing at the White Sands Proving Ground in New Mexico. Locals noticed strange vehicles in the desert, elongated, missiles carried by army trucks, and rumors spread that new weapons were being tested for atomic delivery. Few knew these designs originated from the same engineers who had rained destruction on London just a year earlier. Inside the Army Ordnance Corps, not everyone was comfortable with the arrangement. A confidential report by Major Staver in late 1946 warned, "The ethical implications of employing former Nazi officers are significant. However, the strategic value outweighs the risk." That statement, buried deep in the archives, summarized the cold calculus of Operation Paperclip. Morality was negotiable, knowledge was not. Even the scientists themselves seemed uncertain of their new roles. In letters home, von Braun wrote cautiously, "We are in America now. Our work continues, but under a different flag." To many of them, the transfer was both salvation and exile. They had escaped potential trials at Nuremberg, but they were living on borrowed identities, men reinvented for a new empire. By the end of 1946, more than 500 individuals had been extracted under Paperclip. Some were world-class experts. Others were opportunists hoping to evade justice. The line between them blurred with every ship that left Europe. What united them all was silence. The unspoken understanding that their past would remain buried in exchange for their usefulness. In Germany, the empty homes and erased names left a trail of questions. Families, victims, and former colleagues sought answers that never came. In Washington, however, the operation's success was celebrated in classified briefings. "The assets have been secured," one report read. "American scientific progress assured." But in the shadows of these triumphs, a deeper unease lingered. What had America inherited from its former enemies? And how far was it willing to go to protect that inheritance? As 1947 approached, the transports continued. Unmarked ships crossing the Atlantic under cover of night. Each carried men whose hands had once served the Reich, now pledged to serve a different master. And somewhere in that quiet migration, the line between victory and compromise blurred forever. By the end of 1946, the Atlantic had become a silent corridor for one of the most secret transfers in modern history. Operation Paperclip was no longer a temporary wartime measure. It had become a machine, moving hundreds of scientists and their families from the heart of defeated Germany into the very core of America's military-industrial complex. Fort Bliss, Texas, Redstone Arsenal, Alabama, White Sands, Proving Ground, New Mexico. To the public, these were just names on a map, army testing sites in the post-war desert. But behind the barbed wire and armed guards, the foundation of the modern space and missile era was being laid, built on the expertise of men once loyal to the Third Reich. In early 1947, the first official group of Paperclip scientists arrived at Fort Bliss under the supervision of the US Army Ordnance Corps. Among them, Werner von Braun, Arthur Rudolph, Ernst Stuhlinger, and more than 100 engineers from the Peenemünde team. Their new home was a cluster of barracks in the Texas desert, a strange limbo between exile and opportunity. The army called them special employees, but the soldiers guarding the perimeter knew exactly who they were. Former SS officers, men who had designed the same rockets that had flattened London. Von Braun kept a low profile. He spent his days lecturing American officers on propulsion systems, sketching rocket designs on chalkboards, and writing reports on the future of guided missiles. In one classified presentation to the Army's Ordnance Command, he said, "The V-2 was only the beginning. Given resources and time, we can reach the edge of space." His words caught the imagination of a few forward-thinking officers. Among them, Major General Holger Toftoy, the man who had championed bringing the Germans to America. But not everyone was convinced. Senator Harley Kilgore of West Virginia warned that the US was importing the Nazi war machine under new management. The press never got the full story. The files were too heavily redacted, but whispers spread in Washington that known war criminals were being housed on American soil. Still, the army pressed on. In the early Cold War atmosphere of 1947, fear of Soviet advancement eclipsed moral hesitation. The Soviet Union had just tested captured V-2 components at Kapustin Yar, and Stalin's scientists were rapidly developing their own missile programs using abducted German engineers. America could not afford to fall behind. At White Sands Proving Ground in New Mexico, the first successful American launch of a reconstructed V-2 took place on April 16, 1946. The missile reached an altitude of 70 miles, higher than any man-made object had ever flown. Among the engineers in attendance were both American officers and German specialists, their collaboration uneasy but undeniably effective. Later, the same team began launching upper atmosphere research missions, carrying cosmic ray detectors and biological payloads. NASA would one day call this the dawn of American rocketry. Few would mention that its architects had once served Hitler. Life for the Paperclip scientists was paradoxical. They were well paid, well fed, and given access to American laboratories. Yet they lived under surveillance. Their mail was censored, their movements restricted. They were not allowed to discuss their past, even among themselves. "We are here to work, not to remember," von Braun reportedly told one colleague. The US Army preferred it that way. Progress without questions. Meanwhile, the operation expanded. By 1948, hundreds of additional experts were resettled at Wright Field in Ohio and at the Naval Air Development Center in Pennsylvania. Many specialized in jet propulsion, chemical weapons, and advanced metallurgy. Men like Hermann Becker-Freising and Siegfried Ruff, both implicated in medical atrocities, were quietly employed under new titles: consultants in aviation medicine. Their Nazi pasts had been reduced to footnotes, buried in classified archives stamped "restricted." Inside Redstone Arsenal, the Americans gave von Braun a new laboratory, the Ordnance Guided Missile Center. There, he began redesigning the V-2 for range and stability, creating prototypes that would evolve into the Redstone and Jupiter missiles. The first generation of American ballistic weapons, Toftoy described the atmosphere as electric, like the birth of something entirely new. Yet the irony was unavoidable. The men designing these engines for American freedom were the same who had once built them for Nazi domination. Still, history marched forward. In 1949, when the Soviet Union detonated its first atomic bomb, Washington's fear turned to urgency. President Truman authorized expanded funding for long-range missile research, placing von Braun's team at the center of US defense strategy. Their rockets would soon carry America's nuclear payloads, and later its astronauts. But beneath the triumph of technology, the moral contradictions deepened. Declassified memos from the Office of Military Government in Germany show that army officials deliberately obscured the scientists' Nazi affiliations, destroying or rewriting personnel files before civilian oversight could review them. When one investigator protested, he was told simply, "History will judge results, not methods." That phrase became the unspoken creed of Operation Paperclip. By the early 1950s, the German specialists were nationalized, granted US citizenship, integrated into NASA's predecessor, the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics. The transformation was complete. Men who had once designed weapons of terror now built the machinery of exploration. In towns like Huntsville, Alabama, families of the engineers began to settle. Streets filled with German accents, bakeries, and schools. The locals nicknamed them the Rocket Germans. Few asked too many questions. Still, unease lingered among those who knew the truth. How much of America's progress had been built on compromise? How many crimes had been quietly erased for the sake of competition with the Soviets? As the decade turned, von Braun's team prepared for a new challenge, launching the first American satellite into orbit. The world would soon celebrate it as a triumph of science, but for those who remembered where it began, in the underground tunnels of Mittelwerk, surrounded by forced laborers and the shadow of the swastika, the achievement carried a darker echo. The rockets had changed nations, but the question remained, had they also changed their makers? By the early 1950s, Operation Paperclip had become a quiet success story within the corridors of the Pentagon. but one wrapped in silence and denial. Officially, the program had brought over German scientific personnel to assist in post-war research. Unofficially, it had imported men whose work, and sometimes crimes, had been forged in the darkest corners of Nazi Germany. As American newspapers celebrated breakthroughs in rocketry and jet propulsion, a few investigators began asking uncomfortable questions. Among them was journalist Drew Pearson, who in 1947 published a column titled "Nazis Working for the US." It named Werner von Braun and several of his team members, exposing their SS connections. The War Department dismissed the claims as exaggerated, but privately, they took precautions. Orders went out to censor future press inquiries, and personnel files were reclassified as restricted. The truth was more complicated than any headline could capture. Behind the polished optimism of post-war America, unease was growing among military ethics boards, church groups, and even within the scientific community itself. Could the nation that had defeated Nazism now justify employing its architects? The debate reached a moral crossroads when evidence surfaced from the Nuremberg doctors' trial in 1947. Testimonies detailed the horrific experiments at Dachau, Ravensbrück, and Buchenwald, tests on hypothermia, altitude endurance, and chemical exposure, all in the name of scientific advancement. Many of the men implicated had vanished, absorbed into Paperclip's protective web. One name resurfaced: Dr. Hubertus Strughold. His research under the Luftwaffe Medical Service had involved exposing prisoners to near-vacuum conditions. Dozens had died, yet by 1950, Strughold had become the head of the U.S. Air Force School of Aviation Medicine in Texas. His title, Chief Scientist of the Aerospace Medical Division, he lectured openly about human adaptation to space travel. Hailed in the press as a pioneer, few in America knew his full history. Those who did remained silent. Meanwhile, the Cold War was deepening. Stalin's scientists, including German engineers captured under the Soviet equivalent, Operation Osoaviakhim, were rapidly advancing missile programs at facilities near Moscow. The United States responded in kind. Under the newly formed Department of Defense, von Braun's team at Redstone Arsenal received expanded funding. Their work would lead to the Redstone and Jupiter series, the same rockets that would one day carry nuclear warheads across continents. In Washington, national security trumped morality. When a State Department review board attempted to block visas for several Paperclip scientists in 1951, Army intelligence intervened. Objection overruled, one memo read. Strategic importance outweighs political risk. Files that mentioned SS membership or war crimes were simply rewritten. One officer later recalled, "We were told to clean the paper, not the man." The American public, meanwhile, saw only progress. Films and magazines glorified the rocket pioneers, building the future of space exploration. Von Braun appeared on television, smiling, articulate, a German visionary reborn as an American patriot. Disney even invited him to narrate a series called Man in Space. In living rooms across the country, children watched the man who once built Hitler's rockets now teaching them about journeys to Mars. It was a brilliant act of reinvention and a masterclass in forgetting. But not everyone forgot. In 1952, the US Justice Department quietly reopened investigations into several Paperclip scientists after receiving reports from the newly declassified Nuremberg archives. The findings were disturbing. One internal memo described substantial evidence of moral and legal complicity in wartime crimes. Yet every attempt to bring charges was blocked by military command. The files were sealed again. The phrase stamped on their covers was chillingly simple: not in the interest of national security to pursue. Among intelligence officers, whispers circulated that Operation Paperclip had become too successful to expose. Some scientists, like Arthur Rudolph, had risen to senior positions within America's missile programs. His work on the Saturn V rocket would later make him a national hero, even as his name appeared in wartime records tied to forced labor at Mittelwerk. When, decades later, these connections were revealed, the US quietly revoked his citizenship. But in the 1950s, no one dared question him. The secrecy surrounding Paperclip extended beyond the military. Universities receiving government contracts, including Johns Hopkins, MIT, and the California Institute of Technology, benefited indirectly from the knowledge these men brought. The ethical stain was invisible, But it was there, woven into the DNA of modern science, as one Air Force colonel admitted years later. We built the future on stolen knowledge and buried the bodies under bureaucracy. By the mid-1950s, Operation Paperclip was officially winding down. The files were archived, the scientists naturalized, and the public story rewritten. The US had entered the space age, and the origin of its momentum lay in a moral grey zone that few dared revisit. Yet questions lingered. Questions the government could not permanently suppress. How much had been sacrificed in the pursuit of progress? How many crimes had been washed away in the name of competition with the Soviets? In 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the first artificial satellite to orbit the Earth. The world was stunned. America, despite its imported genius, was suddenly behind. Panic spread through Washington, and once again, the old German team was called to the front. The irony was staggering. The men once responsible for the V2 bombardment of London were now tasked with restoring America's pride, as von Braun and his team prepared their next great project, the Redstone rocket that would lift Explorer 1 into space. The past began to resurface. Journalists and historians were asking new questions about their origins, their ethics, and their loyalties. The curtain of secrecy that had shielded Operation Paperclip for a decade was starting to fray, and behind that curtain lay one haunting truth. To win the future, America had made a pact with the remnants of its enemy, and the price of that bargain was still being counted. The Cold War reached its zenith in the 1960s, and with it, the legacy of Operation Paperclip came fully into view, a legacy both triumphant and deeply unsettling. In 1961, when President John F. Kennedy declared America's ambition to land a man on the moon before the decade's end, few outside the military-industrial complex realized who would make it possible. Behind the polished speeches, the patriotic slogans, and the gleaming rockets stood the same men once employed by Hitler's Third Reich. Their names, Werner von Braun, Arthur Rudolph, Ernst Stuhlinger, now appeared not in war crime tribunals but in NASA press releases. Their laboratories, once buried under German mountains, were now part of the Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville, Alabama. Von Braun had become the face of American progress. He spoke fluent English, smiled for magazine covers, and charmed television audiences with his calm confidence and unshakable belief in exploration. "Our destiny lies beyond this Earth," he told a crowd of reporters in 1965, yet few in that audience knew of his SS officer's rank or the forced laborers who had died building his V2s at Mittelwerk. The transformation was complete, from a weapon designer for tyranny to an icon of human achievement. But as NASA's Saturn rockets thundered skyward, the ghosts of Operation Paperclip stirred once more. Declassified documents, released under mounting pressure from journalists and historians in the late 1960s and early 1970s, revealed the full scale of the program. Over 1,600 scientists and engineers had been secretly transferred to the United States between 1945 and 1959. Many were indeed technical geniuses. Others were complicit in crimes the Nuremberg prosecutors had never been allowed to touch. The files showed deliberate falsifications, erased SS memberships, sanitized biographies, and altered security reviews. The moral cost of victory had finally come due. When reporters questioned the Department of Defense, officials offered cautious justifications. "These men contributed to the defense of the free world," one spokesman said in 1973. Their skills were essential in deterring the Soviet threat. It was true. The missiles they built had formed the backbone of America's strategic deterrent, and their research paved the way to the Apollo program. But that truth could not erase the other one, that the foundations of this triumph had been poured from the ruins of a moral compromise. In Germany, survivors of the Mittelbau-Dora concentration camp, where thousands of forced laborers perished constructing V2 rockets, watched the moon landing with mixed emotions. Some expressed pride that human ingenuity had reached such heights. Others saw only the echo of suffering that had made it possible. "They used the same mines, the same designs," one survivor told a BBC reporter. Only the flag was different. The controversy deepened in the 1980s, when the US Department of Justice's Office of Special Investigations began reviewing paperclip records. Investigators uncovered evidence that some scientists, including Arthur Rudolph, had directly overseen slave labor operations. Under mounting pressure, Rudolph agreed to renounce his US citizenship and return to Germany rather than face prosecution. It was a quiet reckoning decades too late. Most of his colleagues, including von Braun, had already died, celebrated, decorated, and largely unchallenged. For historians, Operation Paperclip became a case study in the collision between ethics and strategy. It exposed how nations at the height of victory can still be seduced by fear. Fear of losing the next war, the next technological race, the next place in history. In the secret calculus of power, moral purity was expendable, technological supremacy was not. Yet beyond politics, the story carried a haunting irony. The knowledge that began as instruments of destruction had also propelled humankind beyond the confines of Earth. The same mathematics that guided the V2's deadly arc now charted trajectories to the moon and beyond. In that paradox lay both redemption and condemnation, the eternal duality of progress born from war. Even today, the remnants of Operation Paperclip echo through America's scientific institutions. The Saturn V rocket stands in museums as a monument to human achievement, but few plaques mention the tunnels of Mittelwerk. In Huntsville, where German engineers once worked behind guarded gates, the US Space and Rocket Center honors von Braun as a visionary. Yet in the archives of the National Archives and the CIA, the unredacted files tell a more complex story, one of ambition, deception, and uneasy salvation. As historians piece together those fragments, one question continues to linger, unanswered. Did Operation Paperclip save the free world, or merely inherit the ambitions of its enemies? Perhaps both. The program's final lesson is not one of triumph, but of consequence. In the pursuit of victory, the United States had embraced its adversary's intellect, and with it, a portion of its shadow. The rockets that carried mankind to the moon were also monuments to the price of pragmatism. The world celebrated the stars, but beneath that celebration lay a truth written not in glory, but in compromise, a truth that still challenges the conscience of history. In the silence after Apollo 11, as humanity looked back upon the Earth from the lunar surface, the question remained suspended in the void. To reach the heavens, how much darkness must we first pass through?